So presumably you have to look for earlier identifiers of the sex of a person, or how do you do it in those circumstances? I mean,
well, that becomes really challenging because it is really difficult looking at the bones to separate little boys from little girls because there are no obvious differences in the bone. And the bones only really start to change at puberty. So it's in that adolescent phase that we start to see a skeleton that takes on feminine or masculine traits. What we will try and do is we'll try and extract DNA. And if from the DNA we can determine that we have the presence of both X and Y chromosomes, then we know that we're looking at a male. If we can't find Y chromosomes, but it's a good conditioned body that we believe we have a full profile, then the likelihood is the individual is female. So DNA may help us, but of course it depends on the level of decomposition of the body, because sometimes the DNA is very, very difficult to extract from a full profile.
And that's so you talk about dental records on cards, because obviously if children start visiting the dentist when their teeth start appearing, there is a chance there's a record there to tie things.
Right. So sex is the first one that we try to identify. And usually that puts people into a bimodal distribution, roughly. So it's either male or female. If we say it's a male individual, then the police know that they can probably eliminate all the females on the missing persons register. So 50% of our possible misspurs, as we call them, missing persons, have been eliminated. Then we'll look at how old was the individual, because we want to know, is this a child? Is this an adolescent? Is this a young adult? Is this a mature adult? Is this an elderly adult? And that age determination also allows the police to remove and filter out some of the missing persons on their list. Then we'll look at their ancestral origin, because there are some characteristics in our body that are a clear indication of a particular group in terms of where we may have come from. But that doesn't mean that we can say you came from Birmingham or you came from Aberdeen. It's about saying somewhere in your ancestral past there is sub-Saharan African traits. Usually it's around the face more than anything. Or there are traits that's an indication this is an individual from much further east in the world. And then the fourth thing we do is we calculate how tall you are. And most of the time, most of the population, certainly in the UK anyway, but around much of the world, falls within 12 inches if you're an adult, somewhere between 5 foot and 6 foot. If you're taller than 6 foot, then you're a little bit of an outlier. And if you're smaller than 5 foot, you're a little bit of an outlier. But most of us fit into that 5 foot to 6 foot category. Now, if you imagine what you then have at the end of that is a profile that says we've got a male, he's aged somewhere between 20 and 25, somewhere between 5'8" and 5'10" in height, and likely to have been white. That allows the police to then start to remove lots of other individuals from that missing persons list. And they might get down then to a very small number that they can then go and investigate. So they'll contact the family and say, you identified your son was missing. Can we come round and talk to you and take a DNA sample, for example, and gain access to their medical records or their dental records? And that's what we call antemortem information, information about you that people knew when you were alive. And what we will do is we will compare that antemortem information to our postmortem information, the information that we can take from the body. And if we can get the two to match, then the chances are what we have is identified that individual.
So, and that process depends heavily on how much of the remains are left, because clearly if tattoos and things like that are showing piercings, that again reduces that kind of...
Well, it does, but if you have piercings, but you still had the jewelry in the piercing, we may no longer have the skin, but we will still have the piece of jewelry that will be able to tell us they had pierced ears or they had pierced nipples or whatever it may have been. And even in decomposed bodies, quite heavily decomposed bodies, we can still predict tattoos. So if there is enough soft tissue, you may have lost the entirety of the skin, but if we can go to your lymph nodes that sit in your armpit or sit in your groin, then they act as pretty much, the hair traps that you get in the shower.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And those lymph nodes collect all the big molecules of dye. So we can look at the lymph nodes, and if your lymph nodes are multicolored, we can say that you had tattoos on that limb, and they were green and they were blue and they were yellow. We can't tell you what the pattern is, but we can tell you that there had been a tattoo there.
That's extraordinary. So when people have a tattoo, there are some parts of the dye that don't fix in the skin, but travel round and give a permanent record of your tattoo, other than just the surface of your skin. That's extraordinary. Absolutely fascinating. Right, so we talked about that. So let's talk a bit about sort of genetic identity and DNA a bit, because DNA is something that's thrown around. And if you watch a detective show now, it's just DNA solved. You know, it would spoil a lot of Poirots and things like that, I think, if that was around at the time. But just explain to us the process and the extraction process of DNA. Obviously, people might be used to doing swabs now, but and how DNA is potentially affected as a body decomposes and disappears, and the problems that arise from that.
We've got to remember that the application of DNA in the forensic world, you know, I'm very old. I can remember running cases before we had DNA. So it was only when Alec Jeffreys had that eureka moment in the 1980s, when he couldn't get his medical research project to work, that he realized the reason he couldn't do that was because everybody's DNA was slightly different. And that was a huge watershed moment for forensic science. And of course, a great opportunity for crime writers and filmmakers and all sorts of things, because suddenly there was this paradigm shift in investigation. And our juries really firmly believe that every single crime scene is going to have a DNA sample and DNA will solve it. Well, it just doesn't, is the honest truth. If you have not committed a crime, then your DNA doesn't sit on the police DNA database. And certainly in the UK, we don't have a national DNA database. So if we go to the body in the woods and we extract DNA, but that person has lived a crime-free life, there is nothing to compare it with. And that's where the limitation comes. That's why we need to find the other stories of the individual to get to a possible family, because only then can we match the DNA. So until our name and our address are sewn into that double helix, unless we've got something to match it to, it doesn't help us at all. So if the remains are skeletal, there are certain areas in the skeleton that you will preferentially go to find some DNA. And you want to go to areas that are particularly well protected from the environment around you, because as the body is decomposing, it's exposed to weathering, to the sun, to the rain. If it's in a forest, to sort of more acidic conditions. If it's in the sea, then to salt conditions, and DNA doesn't like salt conditions. So that you have to go into the deepest, darkest, hidden little areas that have been protected from all of these insults that the environment is going to throw at DNA. So we will go to things like the roots in the teeth, because they're really well protected, and into the pulp cavity of the tooth. Or we'll go to something like the thigh bone, and right in the middle of the thigh bone, and cut out a donut section of that thigh bone. And they will be sent off to the forensic labs. Now, I'm not a DNA specialist, but what they will do is they will grind down the bone or the tooth, and they will extract the biological material from that sample. They will then run it, they will multiply it through a multiplying method called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, to create lots of copies of it. And then what they can do is they can create a profile, and a profile that allows you to see what that DNA is made up of and the pattern of that DNA from its 4 base pairs. And then if they've got, they use a particular locus on a particular chromosome, and they will look at maybe 12 loci or 15 loci, because they don't look at the entire genome because it's enormous, but just specific areas where they know there's variation. And then they can compare that profile with mum or with dad or with children or with relatives if there's no immediate family. And they will then get a likelihood of match. And sometimes the match is 1 in a billion, because they have mum, they have dad, and they have children. But sometimes it's a lot less than that, because the further removed the family member is that you're comparing the individual to, then the greater becomes the probability that it could be somebody else. So it doesn't solve all the problems.
No,
but
no,
I do think it does.
Particularly if the person's never been reported missing is
Exactly.
the biggest problem. Interesting reference there to PCR, which I assume is the same multiplication process they go through for COVID tests right now.
Yes,
It's
exactly it. Polymerase chain
Didn't
reaction.
know that. The missing person, so the individual, we've started to determine key features of that individual. We determined that male, between 25 and 35, and various things like that. Just go through that process a little bit there in terms of how you then use that to actually track down individuals who are either loved ones, and how you start to pull, or how the process of pulling this together goes now from that. Because you said, I don't know how much of this you actually get to see, because as you say, you stick in your area and you don't want to appear as an expert for someone else who actually has that as their particular expertise. Is this the start of the point of basically where you're handing over the evidence that you've acquired?
Yes.
At this stage.
So we will have recovered the body. We will have identified at the recovery site the things that are present and the things that are missing. And often the things that are missing, certainly in a woodland scenario, would be fingers. Toes are often inside socks and inside shoes, so toes survive, but fingers are there for animals to take away for predation. So we need to be there to say we don't have everything, or we have everything. And sometimes we might have to follow down a fox trail to find the remnants, perhaps going through their own excrement to be able to find fragments of bone. You never know. We will have an idea of the completeness of the body. The more complete the body is, the more confidence we have in identifying the different criteria. Because sometimes if we're dealing with remains from a fire, or we're dealing with remains from an explosion, we might only have tiny fragments of bone. And so being able to tell all the characteristics that we want, actually we just may not be able to achieve. So you can only work with what you're given. And if we can retrieve as much as possible, then from that early stage, we're giving the investigative authorities the best chance of being able to find out who this person was. So we will take the body back to the mortuary. And in the mortuary, we will lay it out in an anatomical position. And we will start to look at, is there anything else missing? Did we forget something? Sometimes it may be that we have more than one person. And so we may have to separate them out because the remains have become commingled, perhaps, in a plane crash or in a train crash, for example. So we will have to separate out the different individuals. And then we will start to look at them and we'll say, male or female, what age were they? What height were they? Is there any indication of ancestry? Have they got any dental work? If they've got dental work, can we please phone the forensic odontologist so that the dentist needs to come in? They will then chart the teeth. Although we can do it, it's better that the expert does it. We may identify that there are cut marks on the bone. So we'll be questioning, is that a stab wound? It may have been that somebody has tried to dismember the body. So we only have parts of the body, not all of it. And we will look at those dismembered ends and we will try to determine what kind of a tool might have been used. Was it a blade? Was it an axe? Was it a saw? Which was the limb that was first taken off? Because you can usually see a differential in the way in which the whole process goes. All of these things are assessed while the body is on the table in front of you. And once we've handed over all of the information that we can squeeze from this body, that then becomes the police matter. And often at that point, we have no further involvement until we get called into court. And so sometimes there may be a gap of weeks, there may be a gap of years before something gets to court, if it ever gets to court. And we've suddenly got to catch up on all the story that has happened in between that has not been our story because we're not that part of the team.
I think people will find that extraordinary, of course, that you're there just for a period of time in this, and court cases can take years, all this, particularly now as well. And then you just get called in for maybe 1 or 2 days into a court to say your bit of evidence. Do you get to hear what happens at the end of it? Do you stay around till the verdict? How does that work?
Well, that depends where you are. So if you're giving evidence in Scotland, you are only allowed to go into the courtroom to give your own evidence. You cannot hear anybody else's evidence, and you cannot remain as a member of the public. And so that's very much about containing your own perspective of the case. You have no idea what went on before you in the courtroom that week, and you have no involvement of what goes on afterwards. So again, it's this completely compartmentalized approach. In England and Wales, it's slightly different. So you can be in the courtroom right from the beginning, and you can hear what other people are saying, and you can choose to stay in the courtroom if you wish. But that's the thing about our discipline, is that you have to understand the legal jurisdiction in which you're operating. In Scotland, I'm not allowed to take my notes into the courtroom. In England and Wales, I am. So you just have to be aware of the laws as well.
You have to have a good memory as well, by the sounds of it.
Oh, yeah.
Crikey.
Oh, yeah.
And then we move on to one of the last cards here, which is forensic facial reconstruction. So just go into that into a little bit of detail. I think everybody's probably watched these documentaries on television where they try and bring a sort of caveman back to life through facial reconstruction. What are the actual sort of practicalities of that, and how would you be involved?
So I'm involved as the forensic anthropologist by creating that biological profile that says this is a man, and he's in his 20s, and he's probably got light-colored skin. Sometimes we might have hair that's persisting. Sometimes we might have bits of skin so that you can see skin color, but you have to be very careful because skin changes color with decomposition. So the forensic artist, and I'm not a forensic artist, the forensic artist gets the raw information from us about the individual, how old they were when they died, for example, and they have the raw information of that skull. They may choose to cast that skull so they can work on a cast, or they may choose to scan it with a laser so that they can work on a computer. And the technique that I'm most familiar with is the one where you take the skull, and because of the biological information, it's a male and it's white and they're in their 30s or 20s, you know roughly what their skin thickness is likely to be. And so the artist will place small little dowels onto the bone surface that says this is how far out the skin will sit. And then underneath that level, they will fill in every single muscle. Now, there's over 40 muscles in the face. And so they will craft and add all of those muscles onto that skull framework. They'll even put in the salivary glands just so that it pads it out, and the buccal pad of fat if it's a younger individual. And then, a bit like icing a cake, they'll take the skin and they'll place it over the top. And that then gives you the structure of the face. Now, some things like ears and nose and mouth are quite difficult to predict. And so you're never, ever going to get a perfect likeness of the individual. That's not what you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to achieve for the police is something that is close enough that when that image is released to the public, somebody will come forward and say, that looks like Joe Smith. And what the police then have as a lead, they can then go to Joe Smith's family and they can get the DNA sample. So the facial reconstruction is about trying to get that link, that lead that's needed, because the original biological profile we gave just wasn't good enough. It wasn't detailed enough. And the facial reconstruction becomes the next stage. And of course, we've got a number of cases where we've done the facial reconstruction, we've done the biological identification, and nobody has come forward to identify that individual. It might be that there's nobody cares that they went missing, or it might be that the people who know who they are don't want to come forward because they're partly responsible in that individual's death. So we don't always have a successful outcome, which is very, very frustrating.
I can understand that. It's interesting as well with the facial reconstruction, because while most people find it fairly easy to recognize broad features of people's faces, it's very hard to identify visually for certainly a layperson looking at someone's elbow, for example, or kneecap. So I totally see the importance of that.
And of course, what we might not know is what weight you are. So, you know, you look very different when you put on weight than when you take off weight. We won't know if you dye your hair blonde. We won't know if you sport a beard. So, you know, those kind of characteristics that a family might be looking for, we might not be able to tell. So the reconstructions that we do are often in black and white, so that it's not trying to lead somebody that this is someone with blonde hair. And they're usually always clean shaven. And until, of course, you know, sometimes in the archaeological ones, then we can play around with it a little bit more, and that makes it much more fun.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Sue. That was fascinating. I could genuinely speak to you all day or listen to you all day talking about this sort of stuff. I think the Q fans will absolutely love this. So thank you very much for taking part.
It's my pleasure, and I really do hope they enjoyed it. It's just been such a delight. Thank you.